Global, which is a renewable energy platform based in Jerusalem, providing energy for Africa. Aryeh is a former advisor to Natan Sharansky in Israel's Prime Minister's office, and he was the founder and director of Media Central, a Jerusalem-based project providing services for the foreign press in the region. Aryeh is a frequent, and as you will see, very captivating speaker on spirituality, human rights, media issues, renewable energy, and Israel's relationship with Africa, as well as Israeli and Jewish identities. And when he is not hiking or promoting renewable energy, he is growing grapes and making wine. And if you find the talk to be particularly compelling following a short Q&A and want to buy his book and read it and learn more, it is available on the side table over there. And without further ado, Aryeh.
Jake's introduction was more animated, I think, than the talk is going to be. Thank you. I feel like you've gotten to know me in the short time that we've met. Thank you for coming. There is some resonance of my having been invited to speak about human rights and freedom and democracy in the Middle East in these days in the lead up to Martin Luther King's birthday and the commemoration of Martin Luther King. And I wanted to make that connection because when we're talking about human rights and freedom and democracy, often our discussion is kind of very esoteric and kind of or ephemeral. I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but the discussion is often very theoretical. And I think one of the things that's so important for all of us in commemorating Martin Luther King and his effect on American society and the transformation of American society with a focus on the issue of rights, civil rights, human rights, or others, can be felt and understand much more in depth by putting some real flesh on these theoretical ideas. And so that's what I would like to do over the next, let's say, 30 minutes or so, throwing out perhaps what I hope to be some provocative ideas, and then I'm happy to open it up for questions and discussions or what have you. But I really have to start out by saying at least two words of additional introduction in addition to what Jake said. First of all, I want to thank Aryeh and Hillel for inviting me and for sponsoring and for coordinating the event. Your involvement and activism and interest in these issues is, I think, very commendable, and I'm very pleased to be here as part of that. I was not a member of Aryeh. I was, however, a member of Sigma Alpha Mu, and Sigma Alpha Mu, Sammy's, also traditionally was a Jewish fraternity. Never had a house here at Stanford, but I happened to have graduated from UC Berkeley, and I appreciate your welcome. Go Bears! Yeah, I'm really sorry about that this year, but I'm very happy to be here at Stanford, which I can see as my second home. If I hadn't gone to Berkeley, having grown up here in Menlo Park, I literally rode my bike in high school around the campus almost daily. If I didn't go to Berkeley, I would have ended up here at Stanford. So I'm very happy to be back here again. I haven't been here maybe for a good 5 or 6 years. Last time I spoke here was quite a while ago. So thank you for that. And the other thing that I want to kind of make a connection to as well is, well, I guess I made both connections. One was the Sigma Alpha Mu and the Aryeh, and the other was Berkeley Stanford. So that kind of makes things a little bit more personal. And I think one of the most important elements of an understanding the way that we promoted this discussion of connecting Martin Luther King's Day, civil rights issues and human rights and freedom in the Middle East is to talk a little bit about definitions to help frame the discussion that we want to have. So let's start by, let me just ask you a question. How many of you are from this area, like, I don't know, the Bay Area? Okay, a few of you. And how many of you took a plane, an airplane, to get here after the break when the semester started? Okay, certainly most of you. Well, let's ask a different question. How many of you have gotten on a plane here in America in the last 3 years? Is there anybody who hasn't? Okay, nobody who hasn't gotten on a plane. So here's an interesting challenge to our initial ideas of freedoms, of rights. We Americans value inherently our right to privacy. It's enshrined in the Bill of Rights. Illegal search and seizure, habeas corpus, the idea that you cannot be simply stopped on the street and told by an official, a policeman or somebody else, open your bag, let me see what's in there. And yet every time we go to an airport, each of us get in line as somebody opens our suitcases and invades our privacy. They violate our right to privacy. They ask us questions. Who packed your bag? Has it been with you all this time? Did anybody give you anything to carry or to give as a gift to somebody? And I've had my suitcase opened, somebody takes out some women's underwear. Like, that's my business if I like to wear women's underwear. It's not any of his business. We allow violations of our rights in ways that we don't even recognize sometimes. Why? Anybody? Why do we so freely, without even thinking of it, give up our right to privacy?
9/11.
Okay,
We
but
did
that's...
not, we did not have any of these inspections.
Okay, you are correct, but it's not the direction I'm going in. You are correct, historically, but I wasn't asking when or what the precursor.
Security.
Security is one of our answers. If we want to put it into the language of rights, our right to life, our right not to be blown up midair in an airplane, trumps, to use a wonderfully modern turn of phrase, supersedes our right to privacy. And it is so embedded in our understanding of our modern era that we don't think of it anymore. Once, and yes, soon after 9/11, I was in an airport in Cincinnati after giving a talk. I think it was at Kent State, doesn't matter. And there was a fellow checking in next to me, and he was being asked by the person behind the counter, who packed your bags, where are you going, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, I don't want to answer any of these questions. And I complimented her, the service person, I complimented afterwards. I'm Israeli. I've lived in Israel for 35 years. We've had to deal with these issues for the last generation and more. And so I'm used to these kinds of questions. This fellow, it's the first time he'd flown apparently, and he started to get angry. Why are you asking me these questions? And she said very professionally, I'm sorry, sir, I have to ask you these questions. It's mandated by the federal authorities or what have you. And that's where it got interesting, because he still was giving her some pushback, and she said, clearly, there's training for this kind of thing that she was prepared for. She said, sir, you do not have to answer my questions. If you would prefer, you may walk, you may drive, you may take a train, you may take a boat, you can get on a horse. There are other modes of transportation for you to get where you need to go. I am instructed and am obligated to ask these questions to ensure the safety of all our passengers. Now, this entire anecdote took way longer than we needed to illustrate the point that today we take it for granted that we allow our right to privacy to be violated in the name of a higher privilege, right, or benefit, which is public safety. Now, you might think, well, that's just a one-off example, but there's a lot of things in our modern life today that reflect this reality that sometimes our rights are limited. When we talk about whatever kind of rights we want to talk about, let's talk about our freedom of movement, another fundamental right that we in the West enjoy. Nobody's allowed to tell us where we can go or where we can't go, etc. But did you know that in Chicago just a few years ago, there was a curfew? If you were under the age of 16, you were not allowed to be out on the street after 11 o'clock. In France, after riots there a few years ago, in a number of the arrondissements around Paris where there was rioting, there was a curfew. Not only under 16-year-olds, nobody was allowed to be on the street after midnight. The fount of democracy, France, liberté, égalité, and fraternity, limited and restricted freedom of movement within their society. Why did they do that? Well, the parallel is very similar to why we allow the invasion of our right to privacy, for public safety. We're all, I think, relatively familiar with Oliver Wendell Holmes' statement regarding the freedom of speech that we treasure in America, that freedom of speech does not give an individual a right to shout fire in a crowded theater. And if you're not familiar with that relatively famous turn of phrase, that's because shouting fire in a crowded theater could lead to a stampede and people could be injured or die because of it. Unfortunately, in, again, our modern age, we're all very familiar with things like that that have happened without even anybody yelling fire, stadiums and other situations. In other words, we limit the freedom of speech. Now, we in America treasure our freedom of speech such that it's very rare to find a significant limitation given on the spoken word or even the written word. But it's illegal in America to incite others to violence or to murder. I believe, in fact, most states write it in such a way that it has to be incitement to murder. You cannot say to somebody, go kill him. That's illegal. That limitation of speech, I think we can all, without being lawyers, understand why that makes sense, that it makes sense for our government to limit our freedom of speech, that we cannot instruct somebody to carry out the act of murder. There are other elements of incitement that in our society are still allowed, but in other societies they aren't allowed. So let's take an example, and this has to do with specifics of historical experience. Do you know that in America, you can stand on the street corner and say the Holocaust never happened? It's not illegal, and it may be immoral, it may be socially unacceptable, but, and I'm not here talking about right-wing, left-wing, I'm not talking about domestic politics, I'm just using this example to indicate one last idea of how we in the West allow our rights to be limited for specific reasons sometimes. In Germany, because of their specific historical experience, according to law, and people have been put in prison for simply articulating, saying the words, the Holocaust never happened. It's illegal to say those words in Israel. So, I'm sorry, when I say Israel, yes. In Israel it's not illegal, it's kind of an irony, a twist of. But in Germany it is illegal to say those words. So where is all this going? I just spent 7-8 minutes giving a few examples of how Western societies who champion the idea of rights, civil rights, political rights, and others, limit those rights. What I want us to understand at the beginning of our discussion is that it is actually something that is understood within our Western ideas of society and law, that not everything goes. That sometimes a greater good is achieved by a limitation of whether it's freedom of movement, freedom of speech, right to privacy, or the like. Okay, now let's talk for a second as we begin to move into the Middle East and the discussion of rights and freedoms in the Middle East. Let's take a second to decide and to discuss what do we mean when we talk about rights and freedoms. So here I think we can very briefly agree, because we're at Stanford University, we're in the United States of America, we understand almost without articulating it what we mean when we talk about rights. We believe that human beings have an inalienable or unalienable. Apparently the Declaration of Independence was written with both spellings. I just learned this a few months ago that Thomas Jefferson has, there's in his handwriting, one says inalienable and the other says unalienable. So go figure which one is actually preferred. But we believe as Americans that we have God-given, if you will, an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If we expand that slightly, what we mean is people have a right to live without government interference in their life, to pursue happiness, which means to pursue economic opportunity, and the liberty that you talk about has most to do with the freedom of conscience, the freedom to believe, to think freely, and that's extended then to freedom of speech, the right to say what you like. I'm not now going into the issues of those slight limitations that occasionally do crop up. Freedom of the press is part of that freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, and freedom of speech. Freedom of religion. Freedom of conscience meaning the right to believe something, but the right to believe something also within the context of a religious tradition. Gay rights are, I think, and I don't care how we define them, this isn't a conservative or liberal discussion. I'm not talking about specifics within the context, but the idea that alternative lifestyles that don't hurt anybody should be tolerated within a society and not oppressed or repressed. Gay rights are certainly something that we in the West take for granted, or at least promote. Women's rights, the idea of whether it's a woman's right to her own body or a woman's right to hold property or to travel without the permission or the accompaniment of their brother or uncle or father or the like. These are the kind of rights that I think should inform our discussion if we're going to talk about human rights and freedom in the Middle East. Because if we understand, and I'm going to take it as a given, that we in the West understand that freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of the press, women's rights, let's put gay rights aside for a second, because I don't want to have a discussion about transforming traditional societies to become more modern. I'm talking about, and gay rights, women's rights, and those issues are partially social issues within the context of traditional hierarchical or misogynist or whatever societies, and they're slightly different in terms of the application today to some of these more fundamental rights of freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of movement, freedom of the press, and the like. But at base, we take these for granted. And if we take these for granted and we want to have a conversation about human rights in the Middle East, then we have to ask ourselves, where can we find, within the context of the societies that are today existing in the Middle East, where are there societies where these rights are being trampled? Where are there societies where these rights are being upheld and promoted? You can look at Freedom House, which ranks societies and nations around the world, either being free or partially free or not free. And the majority of the countries in the Middle East, unfortunately, are listed as not free. And even more unfortunately, more and more today are becoming not free, that used to be partially free. Lebanon, Jordan, these countries used to be partially free, and they're moving now more and more into the non-free category, unfortunately. You know, what's phenomenal is that when we first planned this date of this talk to coincide with, or to at least connect to, Martin Luther King's Day and the discussion of the civil rights movement, the issues of equality and the like here in America, we didn't know that the people of Iran were going to be out on the streets in the last week fighting for these very principles that we're talking about, just as they did in January 2009, 11 years ago, standing up to their autocratic, totalitarian regime of the mullahs of Iran and demanding accountability, freedom, liberty, the kind of right that we're discussing here today. Now, if you're interested in the discussion that we'll have afterwards, because I just want to throw out a few more ideas and then I'm happy to have more of a conversation, we can talk about what role the West can play in this situation. We can talk about what's happening in Iran and how does that affect the rest of the Middle East. I don't want to get into the domestic political issues here, Democrats, Republicans, the Iran agreement, whether we should or shouldn't have taken out Soleimani. We can discuss that if you'd like, but that's not the point that I want to make as our central discussion. Natan Sharansky wrote a fascinating book called The Case for Democracy over a decade ago, and in it, he says three things which I think enables us to have a little bit of a basis for why we should even be sitting around talking about these issues. Middle East is over there. I mean, we agree human rights and freedom and democracy is very important, but not necessarily for every society and not necessarily for every time. Why should we be talking about that now here at Stanford University in January of 2020? The answer is, Sharansky writes in his book that we have a conceptual framework which gives us the right to promote human rights and freedom and democracy to all of humanity. If every individual is born with, as far as we're concerned, these inalienable rights to freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of movement, what have you, if we agree, and I think we should agree, that every individual actually wants and has a desire to express those rights within their life, even if they do so within a traditional or hierarchical society, Eastern, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, or what have you, all of us are born with a desire to be responsible for our own lives. All of us are born with the desire to take charge of our lives and to be free. And what Sharansky says is that we have a right, as it were. We shouldn't question that right to help foment freedom in societies which are today not free. But he also says we have a responsibility to do so. It's not just that it's okay morally for us to help to want to promote greater rights and freedoms around the world. We have a responsibility to do so precisely because of that philosophical framework that we accept that these rights are inalienable, that these rights are part of the human condition. And by the way, ask me if you'd like in our discussion, And we can go into some depth about how that concept is actually based on the Hebrew Bible. I mean, we are in a Hillel. Many of us, if not all of us, are Jewish here, and even those who aren't may be interested in delving a bit deeper into the Jewish sources of modern democratic political theory, which are all based on not just general Jewish sources, and I can quote to you from the Talmud, from the Bible, and elsewhere, but at base, humanity being created in the image of God, as described in Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, is the basis for almost all of the rest of what we consider modern political theory focused on issues of equality, human dignity, and freedom. An interesting kind of tangent. If you'd like, we can explore more. But the idea that Sharansky was presenting was not only do we have a right to promote human rights and freedom in the world, we have a responsibility to do so. And the third point that he made was we have the ability to do so. That we in the West, we in the free world, don't just have the right and the responsibility, but we have the ability to help foment these kinds of transformations in non-free societies. He's not talking about invading a country and forcing them to adopt our methods or structures of government, but he is talking about using the kind of influence and soft power, as it were, that we're all very familiar with, even today and this week. Very interesting, by the way. I want to close with an observation. I read today in the San Francisco Chronicle, unattributed, it was an AP, an Associated Press article by two authors, quoting unnamed, there are those who say, that kind of an article, criticizing President Trump and other leaders of the West, not specifically Trump, but this is America, so it's focused on Trump, for supporting the protests against the Iranian regime, criticizing his support for the popular protests. And I found that fascinating because back in 2009, the first month of President Obama's first administration, there were hundreds of thousands of people rioting on the streets of Iran. And Sharansky, among others, came out and begged the leaders of the West to give support, just moral support, just verbal support, not arms, not money, not pressure on the Iranian government, but at least to show that the Western world was behind and supportive of the desire for the Iranian people to throw off the yoke of their oppressive, totalitarian, authoritarian regime that they lived under since 1979. And here we are again, 11 years later, in a very similar situation. And what's interesting, this is not about Trump and Obama, I want to make that clear, because it has to do with Angela Merkel, it has to do with Boris Johnson and leaders in England and others in France and also, that today, most of the Western world is much more aware of the power of the kind of support that can be given to popular uprisings, especially in the Middle East, against the authoritarian regimes there, because we've seen what happened in Tunisia, in Egypt, in other countries in the Middle East, including in Iraq, where we've seen the power of Western support and how important that is for those who are trying to throw off the yoke of these oppressive regimes. And that's where we come full circle to what Sharansky talked about both in his book and prior. Because for the Soviet Jewry movement and for the human rights movement, Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov and Sharansky and the others in the human rights movement in the Soviet Union, they have often talked about how important the moral support that they received from the West was. Statements by American leaders, congressional action of linking most favored nation status, the SALT arms talks, trade, wheat sales, linking that to an opening of the Soviet system to provide or to allow for some dissent in the system, was instrumental in the end in bringing down the Soviet totalitarian system. I'm hoping that the leaders of the Western world have learned that lesson now, because that's what the Iranian people both are deserving of today, and also if you read, or if you see on YouTube, if you see on social media, that's what they are asking for. Not arms, not an invasion, not money, not related to the issue of the agreement, a joint agreement between Europe, America, and Iran, but the support for their uprising against their totalitarian leaders. If we want to talk about freedom and equality and human rights in the Middle East, that's where we need to start. If you have a regime that's killing thousands and maiming thousands of its own citizens for demonstrating in the streets, if you have regimes across the Middle East who are throwing in jail and giving beatings to people who post criticism of their authoritarian leaders on Facebook, if you have regimes which are allowing or even encouraging incitement to violence, doesn't matter whether it's anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, anti-Christian, anti-West, if we have regimes that are allowing or encouraging honor killings of women or female genital mutilation, or if we have regimes that are restricting freedoms of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, all of these rights that we were describing earlier, it's our right and our obligation, and we have the ability to pressure those societies and those regimes to allow more freedom in their societies. And that, to a certain extent, just to kind of come full circle, is what is probably going to be the surest guarantee of any real peaceful relations between those countries in the Middle East and each other, these countries which have been at war with each other for centuries, and with Israel, and with America, and Europe, and the rest of the world. I'm going to stop there. I think I've thrown out a few, at least I hope, provocative ideas, and I'd be delighted to take your questions, or feel free to argue with me if you'd like, after you've absorbed kind of some of the things that I've shared with you, or ask me to go more into detail into any particular avenue.